Hey squad, it's Shay, and today we're gonna do a little art challenge. Don't know if you guys have seen the color palette challenges. Usually people use randomized color palettes to make characters from what I've seen. Maybe there are people that make full scenes, but today I decided not to only tackle that, but to do 4 different color palettes all combined into one image. Honestly, it's easier to show than to tell with this kind of thing because the palettes will, in theory, remain separated but still in one image. Kind of like segmentations, I suppose. But I use the app Coolors on my iPad to do this in terms of picking a randomized palette. I skipped past this first one just because that's, the app is opening up, it doesn't count. But then I hit randomize for the next 4. With this first design, I knew I was in trouble because these palettes are drastically different. There's just a lot of contrasting saturations, a lot of contrasting hues, obviously. It did just make things pretty difficult because it wasn't leaning heavily towards cool versus warm. So things definitely were overwhelming for me at the beginning here. I think it was a tough one to start out with, but I do end up doing this challenge in 2 more images, which you'll see in this video. Looking back though, this honestly was the best scenario for colors. You don't want them to be too similar to where you're not having enough differentiation, and there was a good balance between dark darks and light lights. It wasn't all mid-tones, so that was also very helpful. When it came to starting this challenge up with this first drawing, I knew I needed to sketch a lot, and that is exactly what I did. I have the bad habit of going with my first idea most of the time, but in this instance I knew I had to get these colors separated out in a way that looked balanced, so a lot of that time was spent balancing which palette would be the background versus which would be the main part of the drawing. I did find it really challenging because especially with that palette that is just in all red and then there are grays and blacks, that one was very hard to fit in and not be incredibly jarring. But then whenever I did try to sketch it out as being the main focal point, it was just not different enough or didn't have enough contrast to really stand out the way it should. I think this comes down to the fact that this palette has the closest to a pure white and the closest to a pure black. So even though the colors, of course, were not very different within them, just having that level of contrast just made it very difficult to fit in, especially considering those 2 reds are essentially the same color. If you really put them side by side, one is slightly darker, but I also felt as if I was missing out on a color by using that palette. So in the end, my workaround of that was to throw it in the background, but that was just the one palette. Each palette had its challenge. I mean, the one I ended up using as the main focal point with that bright orange and it has that blue, those are contrasting colors within themselves, so that one really needed to be the main focus just because it is going to draw the most attention. And it also was the most saturated. Going into this first drawing, my purpose for this video was actually to make my YouTube banner. So that was going to be all I was doing, and using this color palette thing as kind of a more interesting hook. Now, I don't know what I did wrong and I need to look back into it, but the sizing did not work out for this to be a banner. But that is why this piece is also heavily focused on incorporating my little starfish character and water themes and stuff. But going forward, that won't be the case. I also was really focused on trying to balance the palettes as much as possible in terms of how much of each of the palettes were being used. So this piece did end up getting segmented pretty evenly, where each palette sort of has its own section, and that was by design. I thought if I sort of chickened out and just made the red palette the starfish over her eye, for example, and not the background, or not give it its own space, then that wouldn't really be following the challenge. I do think doing that could have made the overall piece look a lot less busy and a lot less contrasting and dreamlike, but I did think in following the spirit of using all of these colors, I really ought to use all these colors. Now at the end here, when this was going to be my channel's banner, I was messing around with the idea of adding some overlay layers or different things on top of it to kind of chill out the chaotic nature, just so it goes with my channel's theming a bit more. That didn't end up sticking around. I didn't use any overlay layers or change any of the colors, but what did stick around was a noise layer. And from what I understand about that, that shouldn't have changed any of the colors underneath, but it does bring more colors into it technically. By the time I did change my idea and went back to fix it, I merged all the layers together. So there is a noise layer over it. Is that breaking the law? Should I get death by firing squad? I mean, all of these are very fair questions. The next drawing I did has kind of the opposite problem when it comes to the palettes I got in this randomizer. They are all incredibly similar, and there are a lot of midtones. Every palette but one has some kind of green color in it, and a lot of the greens are very similar. Going into this, I did plan on doing the same technique as my first attempt in terms of sketching a lot of variations, but the idea came very clearly to me this time, and a lot of that is just because the nature of the idea is not the most creative. I ended up using those blue colors in the background as a sky, the green ones as grass, and the whole thing is very fantasy. I did this drawing over the course of a couple days. For whatever reason, I just kept getting bored halfway through. Maybe the palettes weren't as stimulating because they were so similar, I'm not totally sure. But because of that, I think the piece looks a little bit disjointed. I kind of went stylistically different for different parts of it. And when I was working on different pieces in between doing this one, I would come back and forget what brush I was using, what size everything was. Everything felt like a free-for-all in that kind of way. I just was going in and doing a lot of overpainting, a lot more than I typically do. I do think it was freeing in that way to not have a super strict line art to follow. But the only negative about that is I think this piece could have used a strong line art separation. With these very similar colors, I think having a more stylized line art could have really gone a long way in separating them. Because while I do like the final image fine, that is my number one complaint by far. There's just not enough contrast. I think the whole thing gets a little bit lost. The sectioning of the palettes, it's a little bit less obvious in this one, which wasn't on purpose. That was more so just because the colors were a lot more similar. But beyond that, my favorite part is definitely my little fairy girl. I do think she's doing some kind of nature, flower, grow, earth bending magic of some kind. The flowers in the background were definitely more of a design element than an actual story plan, but it's something nature related. I don't know. She's green like that green bean guy and kind of ogre like, but I'm a big fan of her. She's definitely my favorite part. I will say that I think I learned a lot from doing this piece, especially even with the technique of the overpainting. I will definitely utilize that going forward in various projects. It was really fun. The flowers was really fun, just going over it, letting loose. I had a really good time with it. It looked a little bit more painterly than what I usually go for, and I enjoyed that a lot. So all is not lost. Not the happiest with the final product, but I am happy with the process and what I learned. Okay, the next drawing, I decided to just do 2 palettes. It was just going to be a quick sketch to kind of finalize things into, I don't know, have more than 2 drawings, I guess, was really what made me decide to do this. But I had to speed up the footage of me picking the colors because I took so long to even screenshot the green, because by the time we got there, I was just in shock. These 2 palettes together, that's a tough ask. I think had I kept going and done the normal 4, maybe it could have balanced out a little bit more, but because I did stick with these 2, it ended up just being really difficult. Because of that, and knowing that going in that this would be a tough one, I did a lot of the sketching again. Definitely a lot quicker. This was just to even see how these colors would interact together, if I could do something at all that would look like a final product. With those bright greens, my mind immediately went to a sci-fi scene of some kind, maybe cloning, or I drew that fish in a tank, but what I ended up going with was the mushroom angle. This was originally going to be more of a sketch, especially because the colors were just really off-putting. I didn't think I could successfully make a good end product with my skill set at the moment. I basically finished my first pass in a day, and that was when I got the beaver bear creature pretty much as rendered as I was going to. There was that swirly background and everything looked, I guess, passable if you are calling it a sketch. but when I came back to get this footage for the video, I knew I couldn't leave it there. So basically, I'm a hero, and I went back and I added an actual background, and actually it made the drawing be maybe my favorite out of the bunch, which is silly because I spent significantly less time on it. All of these pieces ended up a very different vibe, and I think that was really fun. The palette really determined where I was going with each of them, and I think that could be a really great source of inspiration if anybody is stuck on their art lately. Thanks for sticking around for this video. It's kind of a weird concept, but I would definitely be down to doing it again. Or I know people do use these randomized color palettes for character design a lot, and that is something I desperately need to work on, so maybe that would help in that venture as well. I've been trying to break my art up bit by bit, or break art skills up bit by bit and focus on one thing. In the last video, that was really trying to make a compelling scene and focus on backgrounds. And with this video, the attempt was composition work and, of course, balancing colors. My ideas for the next video, I have a couple of them. I haven't started working on it yet, but I definitely want to do something character based. So be on the lookout for that, and we'll see how it goes. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been Shay, and this has been Creative.